2 Corinthians tonight, Paul's second letter to his brothers and sisters in Corinth. We're going to be in chapter 12. We'll get there eventually. There are three basic problems that are common to all of us. They are sickness, sorrow, and suffering. We may deal with those things in one or two different ways. We may deal with them indirectly as they come into the lives of people we know, as they come into the lives of people we go to church with, people we may work with, people that we're fond of. And so in that sense, we deal with them indirectly. But then there are other times that we deal with them directly as they come into our lives. As a pastor, I have dealt with many sicknesses and times of sorrow and times of suffering indirectly as they've come into the lives of people we've pastored and tried to shepherd, and even folks in our community that I've made connections with through the years. But back on February the 6th of 2018, we experienced it directly as it came into the lives of our family. I remember that night I was sitting in bed. I don't know if I was reading or watching television. I'm not sure what I was doing. My wife Katie was sitting in the living room. My phone was on the bed beside me, and my phone rang, and I looked down, and it was our daughter-in-law, Sheena. Well, Sheena never calls me. It's not that we don't love each other, we don't get along. Your daughter-in-law usually doesn't call her father-in-law. She calls her mother-in-law. So I thought it was our son, TJ. He had lost his phone again. He'd probably left it in a tree stand again. And so I answered it. And it was Sheena. And she asked me if Katie was there. And I said, yes. And she said, would you get her? I need to talk to you guys. And through her tears, I'll never forget. She said, TJ is dead. He had been killed in their driveway while he was working on his pickup. TJ was 35 years old. He and Sheena had three girls: Mallory Page, Ellie Grace, and then the newborn there's Callie Mae. Mallory was 6 years old at the time. Ellie was 2. And Callie was 7 months, almost 8 months. TJ was such a good guy. I mean, I could take all night and tell you about TJ. He owned his own business. He was very, very successful at what he did. He loved the Lord. He served the Lord. He served as a trustee in the church that they were members of. He was the spiritual leader of their home. I mean, really, honestly, he was everything that a mom and dad could possibly hope one of their children would become when they are adults. I mean, he was the epitome of that. He served on the school board in the little town that they lived in. He was loved and respected by so many people. They lived in Burden, Kansas, a population 500. There were over 1,200 people at his funeral. He just impacted a lot of lives all throughout that region. The funeral director talked to me and he said, "Pastor, I've been conducting funerals in this area for 20 years. And he said, number one, I've never seen a funeral in this area this large. And he said, number two, he said, I know these people. I've never seen a funeral so diverse as the crowd that is here today." Needless to say, that night changed our lives forever. And though the initial brokenness of our loss has subsided, the shock waves of pain is something we still experience. And in some ways, we'll always experience at certain times during the year, like Christmas, Thanksgiving, Mother's Day, and Father's Day. We'll feel them every December 3rd, his birthday. We'll certainly feel them every February the 6th for the rest of our lives. The death of our son is something that we will never get over. But by God's grace, it's something that we're learning to get through. And I'm thankful for that. And let me just say something real quick about getting over it. A dear pastor friend of mine who himself had walked through a tragedy with his family shared with me that part of the process of getting over it is coming to the realization of three things. Number one, you don't have to get over it. Number two, I don't want to say this, you can't get over it. And number three, God doesn't require us to get over it. I've heard explained this way. We never tell somebody who's experiencing the joys of life to get over it, to move on. We send a card to a young family congratulating them on the birth of their child. 5 years later, we walk in the house and we open the mail and we pull a card out and it's an invitation to that child's 5th birthday. We never say, "Are you serious? This is like 5 years in a row we've celebrated this kid's birth." It's like, okay, people, we get it. Your kid was born. Let's move on. Get over it. We don't do that. And I try not to get too angry at that mentality, because until it's your grief and your front row at your son's funeral, you just don't get it. Our son's death was not just a moment in time. It's not just a broken bone that will reset. We were touched with something chronic. And the truth that we don't have to get over it, and that we can't get over it, and that God doesn't expect us to get over it, delivers us from the expectations of people who mean well, but they've just never walked our path. It's almost like some people expect those who have experienced a tragedy of some kind to be like one of those old inflatable punching bags. Now, you young folks, time out. We're going to go on a little time travel trip here, okay? We'll be back in a minute. You remember those blow-up punching bags? They were generally white, and they had a weighted bottom, and you'd blow them up. And they'd usually have the face of a clown or something on there. And you would punch it and it would go down and come back. And you'd punch it again and it would go down and come back. And you just kept punching it and it just kept coming back. Let me tell you something tonight. We're humans. We're not inflatable toys. We don't immediately bounce back. The punches that life throws at us can hurt a lot. And then let me explain what I mean by getting through. I'm talking about that time that eventually comes when we accept the horrible events that have brought us so much grief and sorrow. And with the Lord's help, we find the strength to move forward in life in spite of the loss and pain. I believe a sense of closure comes when we finally allow ourselves to accept the reality that what is done, and nothing will bring back the past or undo the damage. And please understand this. Acceptance doesn't mean that everything is okay. But it does mean that you're okay. And that you are choosing to get through it even though you'll never get over it. Are you with me? Does that make sense? As we move into our text, we are reminded that even the most godly people are not exempt from the three things I mentioned a moment ago: sickness, sorrow, and suffering. In my opinion, the greatest Christian, outside of Christ, of course, to walk on the face of the earth was the Apostle Paul. Yet, he knew what it was to deal with all three of those things on a personal level. As a matter of fact, at the close of 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he talks about how he had been whipped and shipwrecked and robbed and mugged and betrayed and jailed and left for dead. And then in this 12th chapter, he mentions something that he had been dealing with for 14 years. Look at it, verse 1. It is not expedient for me, doubtless, to glory. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. Such an one caught up to the third heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell, God knoweth. How that he was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such an one will I glory. Yet of myself I will not glory, but in mine infirmities. For though I would desire to glory, I shall not be a fool. For I will say the truth. But now I forbear, lest any man should think of me above that which he seeth me to be, or that he heareth of me. And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing, this thorn in the flesh, Paul said, I besought the Lord thrice, 3 times, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. We're not told what this thorn in the flesh was. Now, there's a lot of speculation out there, but at the end of the day, it's just that. It's speculation. We don't know. But here's what we do know. It was something that Paul didn't want. Yet he had to live with, as far as we know, for the rest of his life. Did he ever get over it? I doubt it, because he woke up with it every morning. Did he get through it? Did he come to accept it and find the strength to move forward in life in spite of it? And I think the answer is yes. And I think that I say that because of verse 9. He said, most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Now, before I go any further, please know today that I am not offering these things as any kind of expertise. Here's what I want you to understand tonight. I'm a dad who just happens to be a preacher. I'm a dad who misses his son dearly, who still calls his cell phone so I can listen to his voice. I'm a dad who is prone to outbreaks of weeping, sometimes uncontrollably, at the littlest things. I mean, the simplest things. What I'm going to share with you are things that my wife and I we're just learning along the way. Some of these things are things we've learned ourselves. Others are things that we've learned through our personal interaction with various people who've traveled this path. Some of these things are things that we picked up and just have stayed with us through blogs that we've read and books that we've read. And so many of these things are things that we have believed up here for years. Things that we have shared with people that we've pastored and loved on and ministered to. Listen, we've had these things up here for years, but now we're having to learn to accept them in here. And I know that's just 18 inches, but at times it seems like it's miles. And here's the first one. God sees what we don't see. Now, if you're taking notes, I want you to write that down, and then I want you to free up one hand. And I want you to do this. It'll really help you understand what I'm saying. I want you to take your index finger and your thumb, and I want you to make a circle like this. Everybody do it, would you? Help me out. It's going to help you. It really will. Do this. And then I want you to close one eye, and I want you to look through that circle. The point is, God sees what we don't see. This is our perspective on life. Right now, I can see to the back doors. There's a gentleman on the back in blue. There's a lady on the edge. I can see about 2 seats in on each side. That's my perspective. And as we look at life, church, this is our perspective. But this is God's perspective. God sees it all. God sees everything. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He is the beginning and the end. He sees the big picture. There is nothing hidden from him. So nothing takes him by surprise. But because of our limited perspective, I'm telling you, I never saw that phone call coming. I wouldn't have imagined that phone call from this perspective in a million years. Not our family. That doesn't happen to us. At least from that perspective. That caught us totally by surprise. Though God saw it coming, I believe from eternity past, we never saw it. And Katie and I have talked, and we've discussed this, that if we choose to view our son's death from this limited perspective, then the only conclusion we can come to is that life's not fair. From this perspective, God's not fair. From this lens, it's not fair that my daughter-in-law is without a husband. From our limited perspective, it's not fair that his daughters have to live without a daddy. It's not fair that the two oldest ones cry often because they want their daddy. It's not fair that the middle one looks at her mom one night and says, "Mommy, when's Jesus going to fix Daddy and bring him home?" From this perspective, it's not fair that Sheena has to try to answer questions like that. And if I choose to view our son's death through this little hole, it will inevitably lead to things like anger and bitterness and despair and finally a hardened heart. And by the same token, if you choose to respond to things that come your way based on your limited perspective, then it will lead to the same things in your life. Let me tell you some things about God that we're having to come to grips with. God's sovereign. That's a Bible truth. God is sovereign. And because he's sovereign, he can do whatever he wants to. He has the right to deal with us any way he chooses. Because God is sovereign, he doesn't have to treat us like he treats our neighbors. Because God is sovereign, he doesn't have to treat us today like he treated us yesterday. Because God is sovereign, he's not obligated to live up to our expectations or to explain himself. If we're going to eventually get through what we will never get over, we have to remember that God has a broader perspective. God sees what we don't see. And here's something else, and this is really hard to wrap our minds around. God allows what we wouldn't allow. At the end of the day, whether we like it or not, God's plans are different and even better than ours. Now, church, please believe me when I say I'm not being flippant here. I'm not just spewing out a bunch of preacher speak. I didn't add this point so I would have 2 points instead of 3 points. Going back to our limited perspective, based on mine, then I have to ask, what could be better than our son living and enjoying life? What could possibly be better than him continuing to contribute to the welfare of his church and his community? What could possibly be better than him continuing to invest in the spiritual lives of his daughters and seeing them saved? I mean, in Paul's case, what could be better than him being able to do the work of the Lord unhindered by some physical ailment? I mean, seriously, how could there be a better plan? And here's my answer. I don't know. I don't know. And what's more, I may never know this side of eternity. Preacher from way back, some of you have probably heard of Vance Havner. He used to say this: over some of our days, God writes, we'll explain later. That's the best I've got. Preacher, I wish I had a better answer. But I don't. I don't know. What happened to our family doesn't make a lick of sense to any of us. But here's what we know is true, and what we choose to believe is that God makes all things beautiful in His time. I'm convinced that as time went on, Paul began to understand to an even greater extent what he said in verse 10, for when I am weak, then am I strong. The longer he lived and the more he encountered, the more beautiful God's plan became. And there are people I know for whom that is true. The longer that they have lived beyond their heartache and beyond their heartbreak, the clearer and more beautiful the picture of God's plan has become. And that may or may not be true for us. I don't know. So what do we do until then? I have a few things I'd like to suggest to you. Number one, release your grief. A crisis always produces strong emotions. Things like grief and anger and fear and depression are always the result of loss. And to be honest with you, those feelings can be really scary. So many times we don't know what to do with them. Here's a few things we shouldn't do with them. We shouldn't resist them by not letting ourselves feel anything. Sadly, that's why so many people turn to prescription drugs, because they help them not feel the pain. We shouldn't rehearse them and torture ourselves over and over again by second guessing and speculating. And believe me, I've done that. What if TJ had been under the truck this way? Or what if he had been under the truck this way? Or what if he had listened to his mechanic buddy who said, I'll come over Saturday and do that. You don't have to worry about it. What if TJ would have just listened to him instead of being stubborn and deciding to do it himself? I've traveled down that road a few times. We shouldn't repress them. God doesn't want us to push our feelings down inside. Many people are stuffers. You know what I'm talking about? Stuffers. But the problem with that is that one day, there's not going to be any more room to stuff anything else. And then what? If you don't learn to deal with your feelings now, then you're going to have to deal with them later. Here's what God wants us to do, and I believe invites us to do. And that is release them. Psalm 18 and verse 6 says, in my distress, I called upon the Lord, and I cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him, even into his ears. And I love this from Psalm 142. I poured out my complaint before him. I showed before him my trouble. Church, understand this. We can go to the Lord with anything. He can handle it. Release your grief. Here's the second thing. Receive help from others. One thing that our family discovered following TJ's death is that we are surrounded by people who love us immensely. And we've had to learn to let them help us. And for a ministry family, that's not easy. Because people don't help us, we help them. That's who we are. That's what we do. So I just want to encourage you to let those who love you help you. And forgive them when they don't know what to say, or when they say the wrong thing, like, how you doing? Do you really want to know? Do you really want your pastor, the man that you look up to and respect as God's man, do you really want to know today how I'm doing? Depending on who it is and what level of friendship we have, I may tell them, because I know they'll be good with it. But then there are others that I could never really tell them. Can I just help you with something today? Can I help you with a better question? Is there anything I can do for you? It's a simple thing, I know. But it's less awkward. Is there anything I can do for you? And listen. Even since I've been preaching this message, I have caught myself asking people, how are you doing? It's a dumb question. Let me tell you how I'm doing right now. I think life stinks, and I'm mad. And I really don't want to see anybody. And I don't want to preach. And I don't want to pray. And I want to read my Bible. There, is that okay? I can't say that to people. So just for future reference. And listen, if you ask me that, I'm not going to be angry. I'm not. And I honestly don't get angry at people at home because, listen, here's what I know. In their heart of hearts, they love me. And they want what's best for me. They just don't know. So just for future reference, a better question would be, what can I do to help? When we talk with someone who is farther along the path of recovery, it encourages us to move forward with hope, believing that it will not always be how it seems right now. And likewise, when we share our experience with those whose lives have been recently shattered, it not only encourages them, but it helps us gain perspective by realizing how far we've come. So receive help from others. Release your grief. And in church, this is a big one. Resist bitterness. Bitterness never changes anything for the better. And there's so much I'd like to say here, but I didn't even put it in here because time doesn't permit. And really much of what I would say probably needs to be a sermon in itself. But here are a couple of things real quick ways to resist bitterness. Number one, accept what cannot be changed. I am convinced that there's not a person alive who would not reverse the events of February the 6th, 2018, if they could. But the reality is, they can't. I was telling a preacher on the way over here, sometimes in my mind it's like TJ's just on a long trip. And he's going to pop in. And he's going to say, hey, Pops. That's not going to happen. He's gone. And he's not coming back. And that being the case, the best thing that we can do, and a very conscious and purposeful decision that Katie and I have made the choice to do, is this: focus on what's left, not on what's lost. I'm not, listen. I'm not saying we're trying to forget TJ. Not at all. So we're not moving on from him. We're moving forward with him. As a matter of fact, our daughter-in-law, Sheena, sent our whole family a video about a month and a half ago of our oldest granddaughter, Mallory. She's playing softball, and she got a hit, and it scored 2 runs. And the texting conversation that followed between our adult children. Katie and I never responded. We just watched as our adult children interacted, reminded us that getting through what you'll never get over isn't about forgetting the painful things that took place. We'll never forget. I mean, it was funny. They just talk about what TJ would have said and how long he would have went on about it and how he would have exaggerated it. It would have been like over the fence. It would have been a grand slam. It would have been, she's the only one that can hit on the team. Nobody else can walk and chew gum at the same time. My daughter's the best. I mean, her daddy would have went on and on and on. And our kids they just went on for 15 minutes, and Katie and I, we were just chuckling. Getting through is about reliving the good memories and refusing to let the painful ones drag us down. Sometimes we can let our painful memories so dominate our minds and our viewpoints that our good memories all but disappear as they get tucked away in some dark corner of our minds. So no, this is not about forgetting our son. It's about choosing not to let his death consume us. Because we still have our daughter-in-law and our granddaughters. We still have our son and his wife and their son. And we still have our daughter and her husband and those two little grandkids. They need Grammy and Papa. Our kids need Mom and Dad. And the last thing that we want TJ's brother and sister to do is resent the death of their brother because it's stolen their mom and dad. And I don't want to grow into an old, grouchy, crotchety pawpaw. I don't want to be that guy. I want my grandkids, that little one in the green, Kelby season just ended. And they got back in Liberal on Wednesday. And Katie called me, said, Huck's been walking all over the house. He's looking for Pawpaw. Wants to know where Pawpaw is. And I want him to always want to be with Pawpaw. But if I get bitter, and I'm angry all the time, and my grandkids aren't going to want to be with me, and my kids aren't going to want them to be with me. Am I okay? So we're choosing to focus on what's left and not just what's lost. So God sees what we don't see. And God allows what we would never allow. And then there's one more thought that I'd like to God has what we don't have. Namely, God has the strength we don't have and the grace we so desperately need. Look at it again in verse 8. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, 3 times, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, and I assume he said this every time, my grace is sufficient. Underline that, circle it, highlight it, whatever you do. My grace is sufficient for thee. And I'm here to tell you that if it were not for God's grace and strength, I have no idea how we would have ever gotten this far. The pain of losing our son was greater than anything I could even begin to describe. But the help that we have received from the Lord is greater than I could even begin to describe. And I mean that. I mean that. I have searched and searched for an adequate description of God's grace. But the best that I can describe it is by saying this: it is His supply for our every need when we need it. His supply for our every need when we need it. And I love, love, love the word sufficient. You know what that means? It means it's enough. Always and forever enough. It would be easier to dip a sponge into the Atlantic or the Pacific and soak up all the water than to exhaust God's supply of grace. It would be easier to suck the oxygen out of the atmosphere with a straw than it would be to exhaust the supply of God's grace. One of my favorite writers, Max Lucado, compared God's inexhaustible supply of grace to a wave crashing against the beach. Will there ever be another one? He asks. Of course there will. No sooner will one wave crash into the sand than another appears. Then another. Then another. This is a picture of God's sufficient grace. Grace is simply another word for God's tumbling, rumbling reservoir of strength and protection. Grace comes to us not occasionally or miserly, but constantly and aggressively, wave upon wave. We barely regained our balance from one breaker, and then bam, here comes another. John 1:16 calls it grace upon grace. We dare to stake our hope on the gladdest news of all. If God permits the challenge, He will provide the grace to meet it. We never exhaust His supply. He never says, stop asking so much, my grace reservoir is running dry. Heaven has no such words. God has enough grace to solve every dilemma you face, wipe every tear you cry, and answer every question you ask. And then he writes this: would we expect anything less from God? 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. When John Newton penned this promise, he did so out of a personal experience. His greatest test came the day that he buried his wife, Mary. He'd loved her dearly and had prayed often that his death would precede hers. But his prayers were not answered. On the day that Mary Newton died, John Newton found strength to preach a Sunday sermon. The next day he visited church members, and later he officiated at his wife's funeral. He grieved, but in his grief he found God's provision. He later wrote, "The Bank of England is too poor to compensate for such a loss as mine. But the Lord, the all-sufficient God, speaks, and it's done. Let those who know Him and trust Him be of good courage. He can give them strength according to their day. He can increase their strength as their trials increase. And what He can do, He has promised that He will do." Thank God for grace. And then let me close with this one last thought. Some have been led to believe wrongly, in my opinion, that when suffering, it's wrong to ask why. As a matter of fact, I was in a conversation just recently in Wichita with a lady, and I didn't preach this message, but she had known what had happened, and she said, "Now I know that we're not supposed to ask why," and I stopped her. And I said, "Who told you that? Where do you find that in the Scriptures? It's not in there. Do you realize that even Jesus asked why? I mean, just a casual reading of the Psalms will tell you that David questioned God numerous times when seeking answers. Lord, how long? That being said, though, let me say this. There is a danger in a persistent focus on why. The longer our question goes unanswered, the more it feeds a sense of entitlement. And as the sense of entitlement grows, it usually leads to bitterness. So we need to be careful in our questioning. And then let me ask you this, and I have thought this over and over and over again. Would an explanation from God really satisfy us? Talking to this dear sister last night, I think, or maybe the night before. She explained the tragedy that she had gone through, and we talked a little bit about this. If I went back to my hotel room tonight, in the middle of the night, God woke me and He said, "Bill, this is why." It's not going to change anything. Because I know me. And I'm going to have more questions. And there will never be an answer that God can give me that will satisfy me. I'm not mad about that. I'm not angry. I'm just saying there's no sense in me wondering why, because it doesn't matter. It's not going to change anything. My daughter-in-law is still a widow in her mid-30s. My grandkids are still going to be without a dad. I'm going to be without a son. My wife's going to be without a son. So it's not like I'm going to go, oh, stupid me, why didn't I see that? An explanation is not going to help. So here's what I say. May God, by His grace, help us to come to a place where our faith and trust in Him is greater than our need to know why. My Father's way may twist and turn. My heart may throb and ache. But in my soul, I'm glad to know He maketh no mistake. My cherished plans may go astray. My hopes may fade away. But still I'll trust my Lord to lead, for He doth know the way. Though night be dark and it may seem that day will never break, I'll pin my faith, my all in Him. He maketh no mistake. There's so much now I cannot see. My eyesight's far too dim. But come what may, I'll simply trust and leave it all to Him. For by and by the mist will lift, and plain it all He'll make. Through all the way, though dark to me, He made not one mistake. Would you pray with me?